If the person you trusted most asked you to save them, and the price was your future, would you say yes? I didn't think I'd ever face that question, not from my own father. But life has a way of unraveling in the quiet moments, threading trouble into places you never thought to guard. For me, it began on an ordinary morning, sunlight soft against the blinds, the smell of coffee still warm in the air, when a single message revealed that a loan account had already been opened in my name. My signature wasn't missing. It had been assumed. That discovery didn't explode into my life. It seeped in, slow and unsettling, like water slipping under a closed door. I had always believed my father to be unshakable, resourceful, stubborn, sometimes reckless, but never dishonest. Yet here I was, staring at documents that tethered my future to a debt I had never agreed to carry. And the truth was harder than the paperwork itself. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was drowning, quietly, the way people do when pride convinces them that confession is failure. He had hoped I would sign without reading, without asking, without realizing what it would cost me. This story isn't just about money. It's about fear disguised as urgency, love pressed into obligations, and the moment you must choose between protecting someone you care about and protecting yourself. It's about the boundary I didn't know I needed until the moment it was crossed. And if you've ever loved someone who made a mistake big enough to swallow you both, then you already understand the ache at the center of this. Stay with me. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. My father arrived on my front porch just after dusk, the boards creaking under his weight, the way they used to when I was a kid sneaking out. He didn't ask to come inside. He simply held out a thick stack of papers, the edges still warm from a home printer pushed past its patience. "Internal Family Loan Agreement," he said, as though the phrase meant something casual, something harmless. I pulled my sweater tighter around me and studied the packet resting against my palms. Lines, clauses, signature blocks, too many for something supposedly simple. The porch light buzzed overhead, flickering once, then steadying itself. I felt the quiet expectation radiating from him, the same kind he used years ago when he wanted a favor I didn't yet understand. I cleared my throat, grounding myself. I had learned that anything urgent in my family usually meant someone else had already made a decision for me. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked wood, thick and humid. I set the papers on my lap, spine straightening as if preparing for cross-examination, even if the only witness here was him. My fingers hovered over the signature page, my pulse tracing a slow, deliberate beat in my wrists. I didn't sign. Not yet. A long time ago, my grandfather taught me that trust isn't blind. It's read line by line, clause by clause. "People change when they need something," he'd said, sharpening a pencil at the kitchen table. Tonight, his voice felt freshly alive. My father exhaled sharply, resisting the urge to tap the stack like a salesman waiting for a handshake. "It's simple," he murmured. "You sign, we move on." I wanted to believe him, or pretend I did, but something inside me stiffened, an instinct deeper than fear, quieter than anger. Care, maybe, or caution shaped by too many blurred boundaries. The porch light cast a long diagonal across the papers, illuminating a faint watermark, thin netting, almost invisible, exactly the type my grandfather favored in his legal drafts. That sight alone tightened something low in my chest. I kept my hand still. Choosing not to move was its own form of clarity. "Just a signature," my father insisted. "You won't lose anything." His voice carried that familiar mixture, soft enough to sound reasonable, sharp enough to cut. I kept my gaze on the forms. "I'm not signing until I understand what I'm responsible for." The words left my mouth steadier than I expected. His jaw tightened. "You don't trust your own father?" "I trust clarity," I replied. The dialogue landed between us like coins dropped into an empty jar. Loud, metallic, undeniable. Inside, I felt a flicker of guilt twist against my ribs, but right beside it rose something sturdier. Self-preservation. Years ago, I might have apologized just to soften the moment. Tonight, I didn't. The porch light hummed, catching the curve of the watermark again, thin threads crossing like a net designed to catch what someone might fall through. My breath came shallow, a reminder that every boundary starts as an inhale someone finally allows themselves. As he waited, I became painfully aware of how thin the line was between devotion and self-betrayal. There had always been an unspoken expectation in my family. Loyalty meant compliance, and questioning meant disrespect. Tonight, that line glowed in my mind like a seam pulled tight. I felt it under my ribs, stretching. A part of me still wanted to be the good daughter, the one who fixes things, smooths things, signs things. But another part whispered that adulthood isn't obedience, it's discernment. I studied my father's face, noticing the impatience building at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't a villain. He was a man afraid of losing something, status, control, or maybe just the illusion that I would always say yes. A cool draft slipped across my ankles from beneath the porch boards, steadying my breath. In that moment, I realized the truth. If I signed out of guilt, I'd be abandoning myself long before any debt arrived. The wind shifted, brushing the smell of damp leaves across the steps, and the porch light flickered again, just enough to illuminate the papers in a pale, unwavering glow. That was when I noticed it clearly. The watermark. A faint grid woven into the page, subtle as a whisper. My grandfather's signature touch. It wasn't decorative. It was his way of saying, "Look closer." I ran my thumb over the textured surface, feeling its slight resistance, like the grit of a boundary someone meant to set long before tonight. My father watched me, arms folded now, foot tapping lightly against the wood. I could sense his impatience rising, but the motif, this safety net symbol, anchored me. The cool air pressed against my cheeks, grounding me in the present. I inhaled slowly, letting the faint paper ink scent steady me. Whatever this was, it required attention, not haste. Just as I opened my mouth to speak, maybe to ask a question, maybe to stall, my phone buzzed violently against the arm of the porch chair. One vibration, then another, then a third, and then silence. 3 missed calls, no messages. The timing felt too sharp to ignore, too coincidental to trust. My father's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to me, expression unreadable. A chill unspooled across my shoulders as I reached for the phone, but didn't unlock it. Something about the stillness that followed, the abrupt quiet, felt heavier than the evening air. I set the phone face down beside the papers, my fingertips tingling. The porch light hummed overhead, its glow settling across the watermark one more time, casting the faint net pattern toward me like a warning, or a reminder. And deep inside, a truth surfaced. Whatever was happening tonight, it wasn't simple. I sat at my kitchen table long after my father left, the silence thick enough to feel along my skin. The papers lay unopened beside my elbow, but my laptop glowed with a quiet insistence. I clicked through old folders, screenshots, scanned receipts, brief text threads I'd buried on purpose. Each file felt like a breadcrumb I had dropped years ago, a trail back to moments I didn't want to revisit. There were messages from my father, asking me to lend my name for small things, utilities, a short-term account, a temporary authorization. At the time, they seemed harmless, almost routine in a family that blurred borders without meaning harm. But as the digital pages loaded one by one, the repetition became undeniable. The pattern wasn't malicious, it was habitual, the kind that grows roots while no one is watching. My shoulders tightened as I scrolled, the glow of the screen cold against my face. I realized I was retracing a history I'd minimized, maybe even erased, simply to keep the peace. The truth didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, steady, and profoundly inconvenient. As I continued clicking through the old files, an uneasy ache spread across my chest, something between affection and dread. Every memory I opened carried two shadows: the version where I helped because I loved him, and the version where I helped because I didn't know how to say no. The difference, I notice now, mattered more than I allowed myself to admit. A loan here, a signature there, a favor that became an expectation. None of it screamed danger at the time, but together they formed a slow bleeding timeline of roles I never agreed to play. I pressed my fingertips to my forehead, feeling the static of old frustration rising, subtle but insistent. I cared for him, deeply, and that was exactly why this was hard. When love is familiar, its misuse can look almost like care. I swallowed a breath, tasting the stale edge of coffee that had been sitting too long. These weren't random memories. They were the scaffolding of a dynamic I no longer wanted to uphold. I found one old voice note he sent years ago. "Just sign it, sweetheart. It's for Dad." Another message followed, text only. "It's just paperwork, nothing complicated." I replayed them, letting the short lines sit in the dim kitchen air. "You said it was temporary," I whispered to no one. The sound cracked slightly, like it came from a version of me I didn't recognize anymore. I rested my forehead on my palm, letting my elbow anchor me to the table. For a moment I wondered if I had contributed to this pattern by being so willing, so quick to absorb the consequences. "Why did I agree back then?" I murmured. The question wasn't accusatory, it was weary and honest. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me, the steady vibration grounding my wandering thoughts. I closed my eyes and let the words fade, knowing they still lingered like dust in a room rarely entered. A quiet realization slid through me. The person I used to be, the one who thought saying yes was a form of kindness, would have signed tonight without reading a single line. That version of me would have apologized for even hesitating. The thought stung, not because I resented her, but because I finally saw her clearly. She wasn't naive. She was hopeful, too hopeful, believing family obligations always came wrapped in good intentions. I felt something tighten inside my chest and then loosen, a small unwinding of a knot I didn't notice forming over the years. I clicked through another file, a blurry screenshot of a transfer confirmation. My name, his reason, my responsibility, his relief. The imbalance felt sharper now. I leaned back in the chair, letting the cool kitchen air brush against my arms. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry that I allowed myself to shrink to fit the outline someone else drew. The room smelled faintly of old paper and weak leftover coffee, an aroma that reminded me of late nights studying for exams, believing diligence could solve anything. My laptop's light washed over the table in a pale rectangle, like a small stage where every file I opened reenacted a history I hadn't fully acknowledged. The documents blurred for a moment when I blinked, and I rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling that familiar pressure building at the base of my skull. I exhaled slowly through my mouth, steadying my breath as though preparing myself for a deposition. The chair beneath me creaked, the sound low and tired. I reached for a yellow folder tucked under a stack of notebooks, old correspondence, printed years ago, most of which I'd forgotten existed. The paper edges felt soft, slightly curled, almost delicate. Even in this quiet kitchen, late at night, the weight of truth didn't crash in. It settled, inevitable, patient, waiting. I opened the folder and found a cluster of documents I barely remembered printing. Application forms, brief authorizations, unsigned statements with my name pre-filled. Lines I had once stepped over without noticing were suddenly clear, sharp as underlined text. These weren't isolated favors. They were a pattern, slow, small, and careful enough to look harmless until seen all at once. My phone buzzed from across the table, the vibration short and contained, almost polite this time. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I let my eyes rest on the pile I'd assembled, the evidence forming a story I had tried too long to minimize. My breath deepened, the air cool against my teeth. I created a new folder on my desktop, typing the name with deliberate slowness, evidence_1. The keystroke sounded final, not dramatic, just clear. And clarity, I realized, was its own form of power. The next morning, I powered on my computer before the sun had fully risen, the screen's pale glow cutting through the dim kitchen like a quiet command. The documents from last night waited where I'd left them, neatly arranged in my new folder. My fingers felt steadier than my thoughts as I connected an external drive, the small device warming quickly beneath my hand. I began copying everything: old messages, scanned receipts, even audio files I once dismissed as unimportant. Each transfer bar filled slowly, methodically, as though the machine understood the gravity of the task. Outside the window, early light pressed against the clouds, a dull silver that matched the mood inside my chest. I wasn't planning an attack. I was building a record. For the first time, I felt less like a daughter scrambling to keep up, and more like a witness gathering facts. The quiet clicks of the mouse echoed through the room, rhythmic and certain. With every file saved, a small measure of fear receded, replaced by something steadier, sharper. My hands trembled faintly when I reached for the next batch of documents, not from fear, but from the weight of permission I was slowly granting myself. For years, I had avoided looking too closely at these patterns, convincing myself they weren't worth examining. But now the tremor in my fingertips felt like a release, not a warning. The more I organized, the more the fog in my mind thinned. I paused once, letting my palms rest flat on the table, exhaling until I felt my breath settle into something calmer, more grounded. I realized clarity wasn't a sudden flash. It was incremental, arriving in pieces as I allowed it. The faint hum of the computer fan filled the quiet, a steady reminder that I was doing something concrete, something protective. I flexed my fingers once, shaking out the last of the hesitation. The truth was no longer a shadow in my periphery. It was here, in front of me, sorted into folders with names that felt strangely dignified. My father called again while I worked. The phone lit up with his name, illuminating the corner of the desk like a spotlight I didn't ask for. I let it ring. When it stopped, a message appeared. "I just need you to trust me." A few seconds later, another. "You're overthinking it." I rested the phone face down and whispered to the empty room. "I'm not overthinking. I'm preparing." Saying it aloud steadied me in a way I didn't expect. I opened a new document and typed out the line I'd rehearsed silently. "I am not refusing help. I am refusing blind obligation." The sentence looked firmer on the screen than it sounded in my head. I sat back, letting the truth of it settle. For the first time in a long while, I felt my voice aligning with my decisions. The faint warmth from the mug beside me rose like a thin ribbon, brushing the underside of my chin. I didn't drink it, I just breathed it in. The more I worked, the clearer the divide became between caution and paranoia. Paranoia imagined threats. Caution documented reality. And the reality here was printed in plain text across every file I opened. I leaned closer to the screen, scanning the layers of information with deliberate, almost clinical attention. I noted dates, references, and unclear terms. I annotated questions in the margins. Why this amount? Why my name? Who benefits? Each question felt like a step forward, not backward. I wasn't trying to trap him. I was trying not to trap myself. A soft current of anxiety moved through me, but it no longer controlled my decisions. It only sharpened them. I pressed a hand lightly to my sternum, feeling my heartbeat steady into something almost resolute. A younger version of me would have apologized for this level of scrutiny. Now, I recognized it as necessary. Truth didn't demand comfort. It demanded honesty. The green indicator light on the external drive blinked in a slow, measured pulse, almost matching the rhythm of my breathing as I worked. The room felt cool, the morning air drifting in through the cracked window, brushing against my bare arms. I felt strangely awake, as though someone had cleared a fog inside my chest. I opened a final set of documents, financial summaries I once skimmed without comprehension. Today, I read each line with the patience of someone who understood what was at stake. The numbers weren't shocking. They were simply factual, indifferent to emotion. I paused, letting the edges of the printed pages graze my fingertips. The paper felt thin but firm, not unlike my resolve. Every detail I absorbed planted me more firmly in myself, as though I were stepping back into a room I had abandoned without realizing it. When I exhaled, the breath left my body slow and steady, almost deliberate. With everything now organized, I opened a blank page and typed 3 lines in bold. Do not sign. Do not rush. Do not stay silent. The words weren't dramatic, they were instructions, boundaries distilled into something I could hold on to. I printed the page and taped it to the top corner of my desk, where the morning light touched it. For a long moment, I stood there, letting the clarity settle into my bones. This wasn't rebellion, it wasn't defiance, it was foundation, a reminder that caution is a form of self-respect. When the printer clicked off and the last sheet slid into the tray, the sound felt like a closing bracket, a quiet punctuation to a long overdue shift. I closed the laptop gently, my fingers lingering on the lid. The room seemed a little quieter than before, but in a way that felt earned. My father insisted we drive together, though we barely spoke on the way. The county office sat quiet under a washed-out morning sky, its glass doors reflecting our shapes back at us. 2 people who once understood each other without effort, now navigating a distance thick as fog. He walked with hurried steps, clutching the paperwork like a lifeline he couldn't risk loosening. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flattening everything into a sterile brightness. A clerk waved us forward to the window, her expression neutral in the practiced way of someone who had seen every kind of family dynamic pass through. My father slid the forms across the counter with a determined breath, as though presenting proof of something more noble than debt. I stood beside him, posture steady, heart carefully guarded. The clerk glanced between us, waiting for my cue. I took the papers in my hands, feeling the weight of ink and expectation pressing against my palms. And I realized this moment mattered more than either of us had prepared for. As I scanned the first few pages, a familiar tightening pulled through my ribs, the kind that comes not from shock, but from recognition. The lines looked straightforward until they didn't. Small phrasing choices, vague terms that softened the severity beneath them. My father leaned in, whispering impatiently, "It's routine, just sign." I kept reading, my breath steady, my eyes tracing each paragraph with deliberate precision. The clerk tapped her pen on the counter lightly, waiting. I lifted my chin slightly, grounding myself. I wasn't stalling, I was understanding. Something in me refused to collapse under the pressure of the moment, the way I once might have. The tension between my shoulder blades hardened, but I stayed focused. The words on the page weren't dangerous by themselves. They were dangerous because of what they implied when paired with his urgency. A cool draft drifted from the vent above, brushing across the back of my neck like a reminder to stay present. My father's voice sharpened. "Come on, they're watching us." I kept the papers open. "I'm reading." "You don't need a lawyer for this." "I think I do." The exchange was brief, quiet, yet loud enough for the clerk to shift her gaze back to the screen in front of her, pretending she hadn't heard. My father's jaw tightened, the muscles working like he was holding back a stronger reaction. I felt the air thicken between us, not heavy with anger, but with something more fragile. His pride, maybe, or his fear. I lowered my eyes back to the page, letting the words settle into clarity. I wasn't provoking him. I was protecting myself. The subtle hum of the overhead lights vibrated in my ears, steady and indifferent. When I finally looked up, The clerk met my eyes briefly, offering a small nod that felt almost like permission to take my time. I inhaled slowly, choosing steadiness over pressure. I understood then that this wasn't just paperwork. It was a boundary disguised as an administrative errand. My pulse thumped against my collarbone, firm but not frantic, grounding me as I turned another page. I saw a blank line labeled Liability of Guarantor, positioned subtly enough to hope someone's eyes might skim past it. Mine didn't. A quiet truth unfurled inside me. My father wasn't trying to deceive me. He was trying to survive something he didn't want to name. But survival couldn't come at the cost of my autonomy. The internal conflict tightened through me, loyalty pressing against logic, affection pulling against clarity. I pressed my thumb lightly along the edge of the paper, the texture dry and thin beneath my skin. A younger version of myself would have folded here, softened by obligation. But that version wasn't steering this moment. I straightened, letting the realization settle like a weight I was finally able to carry without shaking. The room felt colder as I set the papers down on the counter, the smooth laminate cool beneath my fingertips. My father shifted beside me, restless, as though the floor itself had become unsteady. I could hear the faint scrape of his shoe against the tile, a rhythm of impatience I knew well. I kept my expression calm, even as my breath tightened. I looked up at the clerk, who raised her brows with the polite patience of someone waiting for a verdict. My throat felt dry, but my voice emerged steady when I said, "I need legal review before I sign anything." My father exhaled sharply, the sound clipped, almost wounded. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a pale sheen across the counter. I felt the weight of decision settle into my bones, heavier than fear but lighter than regret. The clerk gave a small nod, sliding the papers back toward me. My fingers curled around them slowly, deliberately. My father's pen slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor, the sound ringing against the tile in a way that felt too sharp for such a small object. He didn't pick it up. He simply stared at me, his expression unreadable. Hurt, maybe, or disbelief. I held his gaze, steady but not unkind. The moment stretched, thin as a thread between us. I turned slightly, the papers secure in my grasp, and stepped back from the counter. The silence between us wasn't an argument. It wasn't even anger. It was acknowledgement. Of change, of boundaries, of everything we could no longer pretend was simple. I walked toward the exit, feeling the cool air of the lobby shift around me. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of the pen being nudged by someone's foot, rolling lightly across the tile before settling still. I drove home with the documents sitting on the passenger seat, the weight of them pressing against the silence in the car. When I stepped inside, the house felt dimmer than usual, as though it had absorbed the tension from the morning and decided to hold it for me. I set the papers on the table, then moved toward the old storage cabinet tucked beneath the staircase, an archive of forgotten years and impulsive organization. Dust lifted in thin swirls as I opened the door. Inside were file boxes, mismatched envelopes, and one familiar binder I hadn't touched in years. I pulled it out and set it on the floor, flipping through the pages one by one. Family records, school forms, tax receipts. Then, buried between two unrelated folders, I found an email printout folded neatly into thirds. The sender was a name I hadn't seen since my grandfather passed, his attorney. The subject line was brief but unmistakable. My breath slowed, then steadied as I unfolded the page. The message was dated years before my grandfather's health began to fail. I read the first few lines, recognizing his formal tone, softened by the lawyer's phrasing. The words felt like a hand reaching forward in time, offering something I didn't yet understand when he wrote it. My chest tightened with a quiet ripple of grief, steady, not overwhelming. My father had always said my grandfather trusted me more than anyone else, but I never knew what that meant beyond affection. Now, as I scanned the lines, it felt different, intentional, prepared. I caught myself tracing the indentation of a paperclip long removed, imagining the care he took when sending it. My eyes moved slowly, absorbing every sentence, every detail. The coffee on the table had gone cold, but I didn't reach for it. I just kept reading, feeling the distance between past and present shrink into something startlingly clear. The letter's main paragraph caught me off guard. If she ever feels pressured, confused, or obligated, she should activate the clause for her protection. The phrasing was precise, unmistakably deliberate. I whispered the words out loud, barely audible, as if testing whether they sounded as serious as they looked. They did. I closed my eyes for a moment, the room settling into a quieter stillness. I remembered my grandfather at his old writing desk, the way he always reviewed documents twice, sometimes 3 times, even when they seemed trivial. "Protection doesn't insult trust," he used to say. "It anchors it." Now, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor, those words echoed with new weight. I felt the distance between who I had been and who I was now, narrowing like a narrow hallway I'd finally walked far enough to understand. When I looked down again, the letter hadn't changed, but I had. I folded the printout gently, smoothing the creases with my thumb as a quiet steadiness settled through me. This wasn't a loophole or an escape hatch. It was foresight, woven into something that looked, from a distance, like simple guidance. A part of me wondered if my grandfather had sensed the patterns long before I did, not out of suspicion, but out of understanding how easily love can eclipse judgment. My father wasn't malicious, just accustomed to taking shortcuts through other people's trust. The realization didn't break me. It clarified me. I stood up slowly, letting my legs adjust to the stiff floor, and set the letter on the table beside my father's documents. The contrast between the 2 sets of papers felt sharp, almost symbolic. Outside, a thin ray of afternoon light pushed through the curtains, landing directly across the old printout. I watched the beam stretch, warm and steady, and something inside me aligned with it, quiet, certain. I retrieved a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and placed the old letter on top of it, aligning the edges carefully, almost ceremonially. The air smelled faintly of paper dust and winter sunlight, a cool mix that sharpened my focus. I scanned the letter once more, then reached for the printer to make a clean copy. The machine hummed softly, and I felt a small, inexplicable relief at the sound, like steps being taken on solid ground. When the page emerged, I held it up to the light, noticing the faint texture where the ink thickened. It felt tangible in a way digital files never quite did. I tucked the copy into a crisp folder and placed it next to the loan documents my father had delivered, the contrast between preparation and pressure becoming impossible to ignore. My breath left me slowly, steady and deliberate. I knew what I needed to do next. I added the original letter back into the binder where it had rested for years, then placed the fresh copy into the loan packet. It slid between the pages effortlessly, as though it had been waiting for that exact place all along. The room felt unusually still, as if the house itself was holding its breath with me. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle. Not heavy, but grounding. The late afternoon light stretched across the floor, casting long, soft shadows that reached the edge of the table. I closed the binder with both hands, feeling the gentle thud resonate through my palms. Then I gathered the folder, pressing it lightly against my chest. A quiet certainty rose through me, measured, calm, unmistakably firm. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. I sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread out before me like a quiet accusation. The room washed in the pale early evening light that gathered around the edges of the walls. I typed out a message to my father. I need more time to review everything. It wasn't confrontational, just factual. Within seconds, his reply arrived. There is no time. The speed of his response made something cold settle in my stomach. I set the phone down and drew a slow breath, steadying myself. I turned back to the papers, reading each paragraph with deliberate care. This wasn't about delay. It was about understanding implications that would outlive a signature. A single phrase could shift responsibility in ways difficult to undo. Outside, the wind pushed lightly against the windows, a dull tapping that sounded like a reminder. My fingers brushed the margin of the page, feeling the subtle indentation where the paper had been clipped together earlier. I leaned forward, fully aware that clarity required time no one could rush me out of. His message, short, final, almost rehearsed, echoed through me longer than it should have. A familiar part of me wanted to interpret urgency as need and need as obligation, but the lines were no longer that blurred. I stared at the screen, reading his words again. There is no time. My pulse tightened, not with fear, but with the growing understanding that haste was a tactic, intentional or not. I placed the phone face down and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't dislike helping him. I disliked being cornered. The distinction mattered. I closed my eyes briefly, letting my breath rise and fall until it found a slower rhythm. In the quiet, I remembered something my grandfather once told me, on a late afternoon, much like this. Pressure is not proof of urgency, it's proof of stakes. That sentence, once cryptic, felt suddenly precise. I opened my eyes, steadier. Time wasn't the issue, consent was. I typed another message. I'm not refusing, I am reviewing. I'll sign only when I fully understand what I am responsible for. My thumb hovered over the screen before sending it. When it delivered, I felt a small shift inside me, subtle but firm, like a door clicking into its correct frame. My father didn't reply. The silence that followed wasn't angry or accusatory. It was strategic, and perhaps unintentionally, it confirmed the very reason I needed caution. I set the phone aside and reached for a pen, taking notes in the margins of the documents. Questions formed with surprising ease. Ambiguous lines, undefined liabilities, omissions that would have slipped past me years ago. The act of writing steadied me, each letter a quiet reclaiming of my role in this situation. I wasn't here to obstruct him. I was here to understand myself before committing to anything that carried my name. The distinction felt like its own kind of clarity. As the evening deepened, I felt a tension collecting at the base of my neck, a familiar signal of emotional weight pressing against the rational part of me. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, letting the cool air from the slightly open window drift against my skin. It softened something in me that had been clenched too tightly. The choice I faced wasn't dramatic, it was essential. Signing out of loyalty could feel noble in the moment, yet defenseless later. I pressed a hand lightly against my sternum, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. My father's insistence wasn't malicious. It was rooted in fear of consequences he hadn't prepared for. But fear couldn't dictate my judgment. I opened the folder again, slower this time, acknowledging the responsibility it demanded. The room had taken on a faint chill, the kind that makes every breath feel a little more deliberate. I inhaled deeply, grounding myself in the quiet resolve rising within me. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then with a steady insistence that filled the room with a muted percussion. I watched droplets slide down the glass, blurring the streetlights into thin streaks of gold. The sound steadied my thoughts, granting the sort of focus only bad weather seems to offer. I returned to my notes, reviewing each question I had written earlier. Every line on the page felt sharper now under the soft glow of the overhead lamp. I reached for a blank sheet of paper and drafted a short statement, outlining my concerns in clear, careful language. My handwriting was steady, almost ceremonially neat. I didn't know yet if I would need the statement, but writing it brought a clean sense of order to the turmoil of the past days. The air smelled faintly of damp pavement drifting through the open window. I let it fill my lungs, exhaling slowly. When I finished drafting the letter, I placed it beside the loan documents and sat still for a long moment, letting the quiet reorganize itself around me. My phone remained silent on the table, the screen dark and uninviting. The pressure that had followed me all afternoon settled into something else, something calmer, but no less certain. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, sliding the letter on top, and traced its edge with a fingertip. Tomorrow would demand clarity. Tonight required preparation. The rain outside softened, its rhythm gentler now, tapping against the window like a quiet metronome guiding the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I straightened the papers one last time, grounding myself in the simplicity of order. A slow, steady exhale left my chest, and with it, the last remnants of hesitation. The next morning arrived colder than I expected. Sunlight filtered thin through the blinds as though unsure of itself. I sat at the kitchen table with the documents in front of me when my phone buzzed. A message from a friend who worked at a local bank. She'd followed up on the inquiry I made days earlier, back when I suspected something wasn't adding up. Her text was short. "The account is already active. Your name is on it." The words widened the quiet around me. I read them twice, slower the second time. My breath caught in that muted, suspended way that happens before clarity turns into emotion. I reached for the back of the chair to steady myself, the wooden slats cool beneath my fingertips. The room seemed to tilt, not violently, just enough to shift my understanding of what I was dealing with. My father hadn't been waiting for my signature. He had been positioning it. The first wave wasn't anger. It was disbelief wrapped in a strange, almost tender ache. I wanted to rationalize it, to imagine there had been some misunderstanding or clerical error. But the more I replayed the message, the clearer it became. He had moved forward without me. I closed my eyes, letting a slow breath pull through my chest, steadying the flare of emotion that threatened to rise too quickly. Loyalty can blur into justification, and justification into self-blame, but clarity has a way of cutting clean through both. I wasn't hurt because he needed help. I was hurt because he assumed he already had it. I placed my hand flat on the table, rounding myself against the smooth surface. The morning light shifted, casting a soft glow across the stack of documents, their edges crisp and quietly accusatory. I called my friend, keeping my voice calm even as my pulse tightened. She answered immediately, her tone cautious. "I checked twice," she said. "It's under your name, joint liability, large amount." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening as I asked, "When was it opened?" She replied with a date, one that made the room still for a moment. It was from weeks ago, long before he'd shown up with the papers. I whispered a thank you and hung up. The quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was instructive. I stared at my phone, realizing how carefully the situation had been arranged. He hadn't meant to deceive me. He'd meant to assume consent, hoping the paperwork would catch up with the reality he'd already set in motion. My jaw tightened at the thought. I sat back in my chair, my heartbeat settling into a slow, controlled rhythm as a new understanding formed. I rose from the table and walked toward the window, letting the cool glass press lightly against my palm. Outside, the street was quiet, muted by the lingering chill of morning. I watched a single leaf tumble across the pavement, carried by a breeze that felt both directionless and purposeful. The contradiction mirrored exactly how I felt. I didn't want to villainize him. I didn't want to excuse him either. The truth lived somewhere in the space between those impulses, uncomfortable and steady. I pressed my forehead gently against the glass, breathing in a slow count of 4. When I stepped back, a faint patch of warmth marked where I'd been standing. I turned toward the table again, toward the documents that no longer looked like possibilities, but evidence. My chest tightened, then eased, as if acknowledging a boundary I hadn't realized I'd been avoiding. Returning to the kitchen table, I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and began outlining a new draft, something cleaner, sharper, and more precise. I titled it simply, Revised terms for any financial request. My handwriting came steady, each stroke clear and intentional. I listed conditions: full transparency, independent review, written agreements, zero assumptions. The simplicity of the words steadied me. They weren't demands, they were definitions. Definitions of respect, of limits, of adult responsibility. The overhead light cast a soft circle around the page, making the ink appear darker, firmer. I paused to stretch my fingers, feeling the slight tension along my knuckles ease with emotion. The faint scent of last night's rain drifted through the window, cool and grounding. I exhaled slowly, knowing I was finally articulating what should have been spoken long ago. When I finished the document, I saved a digital copy and renamed the file on my desktop. The old title, just a placeholder, felt too vague, too passive. I replaced it with something that reflected the truth of the moment. Net Clause Draft. The new name settled on the screen with a clarity that felt almost physical. I tapped the edge of the desk lightly, acknowledging the shift inside me. The morning light stretched farther across the table now, catching the edge of the folder, the ink, the phone. Everything felt sharper, defined not by conflict, but by intention. I closed my laptop with deliberate calm, letting the quiet seal itself around the room. The decision I had been circling for days finally stood clear before me. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. By late afternoon, the clouds thickened into a heavy gray curtain, and the air carried that tense stillness right before rain. I was pouring a glass of water when a shadow crossed the window. My father stood on the porch, shoulders hunched, clutching the same stack of documents, now creased, edges softened by weather or handling. When I opened the door, a gust of cool wind swept in, rushing past us like it knew something weighted was about to take place. He held the papers out, rain starting to tap against them. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, voice sharp but thin at the edges. I stepped onto the porch, the boards damp beneath my socks, and reached for the papers. Not to sign, but to study them before they dissolved under the weather. The silence between us stretched, long and taut. As the first droplets darkened the wood at our feet, the wind lifted the corner of the top page, flapping it against his fingers. He pressed it down, frustrated, then looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had a week ago. "This is for the family," he said, louder this time, as if volume could transform intention. His voice carried a desperation I recognized, but didn't fully understand. I wrapped my arms around myself, the chill of the approaching rain creeping across my skin. "I'm not against the family," I answered softly, "but signing debt isn't how loyalty works." His expression flickered, hurt, confusion, irritation, something unspoken curling just beneath all of it. The wind pushed again, carrying the scent of wet pavement and the faint metallic tang that always preceded a storm. I studied his face, realizing this wasn't just about money. It was about the fear of losing control of a narrative he'd been relying on. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do you think I'd ever put you at risk?" "I think you already did," I replied. He tightened his grip on the papers, knuckles paling as the wind whipped at his jacket. The rain had begun to pattern itself across the porch roof, light but insistent. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air settle deep into my lungs. "I'm recording this," I said quietly, placing my phone on the wooden chair beside me. Not as a threat, just as protection. His shoulders tensed. "You don't trust me." His words weren't angry, they were tired, frayed at the edges. I met his gaze without flinching. "I trust clarity." The statement felt like a line drawn across the porch, invisible but steady. He looked at the phone, then back at me, and for a moment his expression softened into something I couldn't quite read. The rain picked up, striking the metal roof in uneven rhythms, each impact echoing the tension building in the narrow space between us. I watched his face shift, pride pulling one way, vulnerability tugging another. For the first time, I saw not the authority he carried, but the weight he bore. Choices made out of fear, shortcuts taken out of survival, consequences ignored until they grew teeth. My heart tightened, not with sympathy alone, but with the understanding that caring for someone didn't mean inheriting their panic. The porch chilled as the temperature dipped, and I rubbed my arms for warmth. "You're not alone," I said quietly. "But you're not allowed to make me responsible for this." His eyes drifted downward, tracing the wet grain of the wood. A drop of water slid from his hairline onto the page he held. He didn't wipe it away. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, the kind that signals the storm hasn't truly begun yet. My father took a step back, the papers now dampened enough that the ink on the top line had started to soften around the edges. He looked at them as though the pages themselves were betraying him. "You used to help me without all this," he murmured. His voice sounded less accusatory and more bewildered, as if he had suddenly realized the ground beneath him had shifted. I shook my head. "I used to help without understanding the cost." The air tasted like rain, cool, sharp, grounding. I straightened my shoulders and added, "I'm not refusing you. I'm refusing danger disguised as urgency." He blinked, absorbing the words slowly, like they were fine print he had skimmed too quickly. The storm gathered around us, thick and expectant. The rain intensified, rattling the roof with a steady, urgent rhythm. My father looked down, defeated or contemplative. I couldn't tell which. A gust of wind lifted the pages again, nearly pulling them from his grasp. He finally exhaled, a long, uneven breath, as though something inside him had loosened. I didn't move. I simply waited, standing in the dim, rain-filtered light of the porch, feeling the air pulse with tension and truth. The papers trembled in his hands, the ink beginning to blur at the corners. He lowered them slowly, letting his arms fall to his sides. Behind us, the roof crackled with rain, each drop loud enough to feel in my chest. And somewhere in that sound, the moment shifted. Not resolved, not broken, but changed in a way neither of us could undo. The storm lingered into the next morning, leaving the yard soaked and the porch board still damp under my feet. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a blank notebook open in front of me. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel rushed. I wrote at the top of the page, in slow, careful letters, "No guarantees, no co-loans, no shared liability." The pen glided across the page, its movement steady, almost meditative. These weren't demands. They were boundaries I'd never named but always needed. The quiet inside the house felt heavier than the rain outside, but in a way that rooted me instead of suffocating me. I kept writing, line after line, defining the financial lines that had blurred for far too long. Each word felt like a reclaiming of something I hadn't realized I'd given away. When I paused to read over the list, the clarity in the ink felt cleaner than any conversation I'd had in years. As I looked down at the page, a familiar voice echoed in my mind. My father's from years ago, half teasing, half serious. "You worry too much." But maybe I hadn't worried enough. Maybe I mistook worry for distrust and silence for respect. Now the distinction felt painfully clear. I tapped the pen against the table, letting the rhythmic click settle the tension in my shoulders. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at the way I had trained myself to minimize what made me uncomfortable. I closed my eyes, inhaling the faint smell of coffee and damp wood. The thought settled deeper. Boundaries didn't betray family. Lack of them did. My breath steadied, flowing in more evenly, gently reshaping the pressure that had sat heavy in my chest for days. When I opened my eyes again, the list felt less like a defense and more like a declaration of adulthood. The phone buzzed beside me, with my father's name across the screen. I let it ring once before answering. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice cautious, stripped of the sharpness it carried yesterday. "We can," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Then tell me, are you afraid I'll drag you into something you can't handle?" he pressed. I let a beat of silence pass. "I'm afraid of repeating mistakes I don't need to repeat," I answered. The quiet on the other end grew long, almost fragile. "I never meant to put you in a corner," he said. "But you did," I replied gently. His breathing shifted, unsteady, clipped. "So what now?" he asked. I glanced at the list in front of me, the ink bold, unmoving. "Now we speak plainly," I said. My hand hovered just above the page, steadying the tremor that wanted to return but didn't. After the call, I closed the notebook softly and set my palms flat against the table, grounding myself in the stillness. The room felt clearer now, stripped of the fog of hesitation. I thought back to all the times I had said yes out of fear of disappointing him, mistaking peacekeeping for care. That version of me was still inside, but she wasn't steering anymore. I stood, stretching my back, feeling the subtle pull beneath my shoulder blades. A release, small but real. I walked to the sink and rinsed my coffee mug, the warm water running over my hands, anchoring me further. When I returned to the table, I opened the notebook again and underlined the top 3 lines, pressing firmly enough that the indentation marked the page beneath it. I wasn't drawing a line out of rebellion. I was drawing one out of necessity. I slid my notebook aside and printed everything I'd written, my list, the questions, the summaries from the past week. The printer hummed, each sheet sliding out warm, crisp, and unambiguous. I gathered them into a folder, smoothing the edges with my thumb. Clarity felt less like confrontation and more like self-respect. The room smelled faintly of warm toner and rain drifting in through the slightly open window. I stepped closer to the glass and breathed in the cool air, letting the lingering storm scent settle something inside me. I returned to the table, the folder in hand, and placed it next to the loan packet. The contrast between them was stark, pressure on one side, intention on the other. I straightened both into neat stacks. The simple order of it eased something tight in my chest. With everything organized, I emailed the compiled information to my late grandfather's lawyer, attaching my questions with a short, precise note. "Please review at your earliest convenience." The moment I hit send, a quiet steadiness filled the room, as if the walls themselves exhaled with me. I sat back, feeling the weight of the past weeks begin to shift, still present, but no longer dictating my next step. The ceiling fan hummed in a low, even rhythm, sweeping the air across my shoulders. I rested my fingertips lightly on the folder of printed boundaries. For the first time in days, maybe longer, the line between caution and fear untangled itself. I wasn't afraid. I was alert. And that difference changed everything. The email arrived just after noon, a small notification in the corner of my screen that felt heavier than its size. I hesitated before opening it, my finger hovering above the trackpad, as if the message might reshape the air in the room. When I finally clicked, the document unfolded slowly, line by line, a calm and meticulous response from my grandfather's attorney. I read the header twice before moving on, grounding myself in the familiar professionalism of his wording. The room around me quieted, even the refrigerator hum fading into something distant. I took a sip of water, the glass cool against my palm, then set it aside. The first paragraph detailed my rights, clear, specific, and unmistakably protective. I felt my breath catch, not from fear, but from a surprising sense of validation. Clarity didn't just settle the confusion, it recalibrated something in me. As I continued reading, my eyes caught on a line that steadied me. "You are under no obligation to sign any document under emotional pressure, implied duty, or familial expectation. The phrasing was concise, almost surgical, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words wash through me, their precision landing where reassurance and reality met. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting parallel lines across my desk like an unintentional underline to the attorney's message. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension between my shoulder blades loosen. The legal clarity didn't erase the emotional complexity, but it untangled the parts I had been silently wrestling with. The thought of my grandfather preparing this measure years ago made my chest warm in a way that tightened my throat. His foresight was not suspicion, it was care. The next portion of the letter outlined the step I had already taken: sending documentation, requesting review, pausing signature. "This constitutes reasonable self-protection," the attorney wrote. My eyes lingered on that phrase. Self-protection, something I had always associated with conflict, not wisdom. I read it again, slower this time. The recognition in those words felt like a small anchor dropped inside me. I placed my hand on the edge of the desk, the wood cool beneath my fingertips, grounding me in the present moment. The faint hum of the laptop fan circled in the background, steady and consistent. I whispered quietly, "I'm allowed to protect myself." Saying it felt both strange and deeply familiar, like remembering a language I used to speak fluently before forgetting its importance. Further down, the attorney added a direct confirmation. "You have full authority to decline participation in any agreement that exposes you to financial liability without your explicit, informed consent." My pulse softened as I read it, an invisible burden lifting slightly from its anchor point beneath my ribs. I let the words settle, then closed my eyes briefly, absorbing their weight. When I opened them, the room felt a degree brighter, not in color, but in clarity. I read the line again, appreciating the cadence of legal language, steady, unemotional, yet powerful. There was something comforting about rules that didn't shift, didn't guilt, didn't insist on urgency. I took a slow breath, feeling the air expand into the space that fear had been occupying. I didn't need to argue with my father about the principle. The principle had already been set, long before either of us arrived at this moment. At the bottom of the email, the attorney had attached a formal confirmation document. I opened it, and the watermark appeared faintly beneath the text, subtle, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar. The pattern caught the light from the lamp on my desk, creating a faint grid that shimmered when I tilted the page slightly. I didn't touch the screen, I just watched the lines appear and fade like a quiet reminder. I inhaled, feeling the air cool along the back of my throat. The confirmation stated plainly that I was within my rights to refuse, postpone, or request independent review of any agreement. Each sentence was clean, unemotional, precise. I downloaded the file, naming it something simple, confirmation.pdf. When the save notification appeared, something inside me settled into place, firm and steady. I clicked reply, typing only one word: activated. The cursor blinked at the end of the message, a steady pulse against the quiet room. I reread the word without overthinking it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defiant. It was simply true. After sending the email, I sat back and let my shoulders drop, feeling a looseness I hadn't felt since this began. The afternoon light softened into a muted gold across the floor, warming the edge of the desk and the side of my hand. I closed the laptop gently, the click of the hinge sounding final in the best possible way. For the first time in days, my breath moved freely, uncoiled from the tight space it had been trapped in. Something had shifted, subtle, certain, irreversible. The morning of the meeting began with an unusual stillness, the kind that makes every sound seem sharper. I spread the documents across my dining table one last time, arranging them in a clean, deliberate order. My notes, the attorney's confirmation, the copied letter from my grandfather, and the draft I had prepared. The neatness steadied me. I printed my formal response and slipped it into a clear sleeve, the plastic cool against my fingertips. Before leaving the house, I gathered a neutral witness, someone who had nothing to gain or lose from what was about to unfold. Inviting her felt strange, almost ceremonial, but necessary. She met me at the driveway, her expression calm, her presence grounding. As we walked toward the car, the early light settled over the yard, soft and steady. I felt the weight of the folder under my arm and adjusted my grip. I wasn't going to the meeting to argue. I was going to state the truth plainly. My father tried calling twice before we arrived. I didn't answer. The calls felt premature, like attempts to shift the tone before the facts could speak for themselves. I let the phone rest face down in my bag as I focused on my breathing. Slow inhales, slower exhales. In the passenger seat, the witness flipped softly through a small notebook, giving me quiet company without prying. As we pulled into the parking lot of the office building, I noticed the way my hands no longer trembled when I reached for the folder. There was a steadiness in me that felt earned, not forced. I stepped out of the car and inhaled the crisp air, letting it settle into my lungs. The sun hovered low, casting long shadows on the walkway ahead. It felt like stepping into a room I had once left unfinished. Today, I intended to close it properly. Inside the lobby, the air carried the faint scent of polished floors and old paper, sterile, predictable, almost comforting in its formality. My father was already waiting near the elevator, tapping his foot in a rhythm that betrayed his impatience. He paused when he saw me and glanced at the witness before looking back at me. "Why did you bring someone?" he asked quietly. "I want everything to be clear," I answered. His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded once, resigned or simply tired. As we rode up to the meeting room, the elevator hummed with a low, steady vibration. My father avoided eye contact, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the tightness of someone who had built a plan and suddenly realized it wouldn't stand unquestioned. I clutched the folder lightly against my chest, feeling the thin edges of the documents press through the cover like a reminder of the boundary I'd come here to protect. When we entered the small conference room, I placed my materials on the table with deliberate care. A clean surface, a clean start. My father stood beside the window, staring out at the parking lot, as though searching for something that could tilt the situation back in his favor. I watched him for a moment, noting the exhaustion in his profile, the curve of his shoulders, the faint sad beneath his eyes. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt present. The witness sat quietly at the far end of the table, offering the kind of steady silence that made the air feel more structured. I took a slow breath, letting it expand through my ribs. Then I opened the folder, spreading out the documents in a clear line. Everything was in place, arranged not as ammunition but as facts. Facts that stood without needing embellishment. My father finally took a seat, his movements slower than usual, as if bracing himself. I slid the attorney's confirmation toward him first. "I reviewed everything," I said, my voice calm, "and this outlines my rights." He skimmed the top lines, his jaw tightening as the meaning sank in. "You think I'd force you into something dangerous?" he murmured. I steepled my fingers. "I think you underestimated the consequences you were asking me to share." The room fell into a delicate quiet, interrupted only by the faint hum of the ceiling vent. He didn't argue. His silence said more than a rebuttal ever could. I watched him absorb the information, slowly, begrudgingly, but fully. The facts reached him before emotion could interfere, and I sensed something in the room shift, almost imperceptibly. When everything had been said that needed saying, I placed my written response on top of the packet, the one I drafted the night before. My father stared at it, then at me, as though weighing something unspoken. The witness watched quietly, her posture neutral. I exhaled in a slow, measured breath. My father reached out but stopped halfway, letting his hand fall back to the table. "You've made up your mind," he said quietly. It wasn't accusation, it was recognition. I nodded. The air settled into a stillness that felt final without being cruel. I gathered the papers, closed the folder, and stood. As we left the room, the soft click of the door behind us echoed, like the end of a long, overdue chapter. The meeting room felt colder than the hallway outside, the kind of chill that sharpened every breath. I took a seat across from my father, the witness beside me, and a bank representative settling into the chair opposite him. The table between us was small, deceptively ordinary, but it carried a gravity that made the air feel denser. My father clasped his hands together as though bracing himself. The representative began reviewing the packet, sliding each page forward with a practiced efficiency. My father spoke first, his tone carrying a familiar, manufactured calm. "We're here to finalize the loan." I kept my gaze steady. My fingertips pressed lightly against the edge of my folder, steadying myself as the room echoed with the shuffling of paper. The representative lifted his eyes, waiting for my acknowledgement. I inhaled deeply, the moment settling into the center of my chest like a weight I intended to lift carefully. My father cleared his throat, sliding a pen toward me with a soft scrape against the table. "Just sign the final page," he said, measured but insistent. The witness shifted slightly, her presence grounding me more than she realized. I looked at the pen, not with fear, but with an awareness sharpened by the past days. "Before we continue," I said, "there's something I need to submit." I reached for my folder, pulling out the letter from the attorney. My movements were slow, intentional, allowing the paper to rest flat between us. My father's expression faltered, the first crack in the steady facade he'd maintained since we arrived. The representative leaned forward, eyes scanning the header. The room's hum faded into a low stillness as the words did what they were designed to do: define, clarify, protect. My father tried to speak, but the representative raised a hand gently, signaling the need for silence while he read. The quiet stretched, punctuated only by the subtle creak of the witness shifting her weight. My father watched the page with the tense impatience of someone willing clarity to bend. When the representative finished, he placed the letter back on the table and folded his hands. "This states she has the legal right to decline participation under any form of pressure," he said. His tone was neutral, but the weight of the words landed with unmistakable finality. My father's eyes dropped to the table. "This is family," he murmured. I met his gaze. "Family isn't consent," I said softly. The truth didn't sting, it settled. A long breath escaped my father, the kind that carries resignation more than resistance. The representative began gathering the papers, sliding them back into the manila folder. "Without voluntary participation, the application cannot proceed," he said. His professionalism created a clean distance, one my father could not negotiate with emotion alone. For a moment, my father looked older, as though carrying the weight of debts that went beyond numbers. I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it didn't blur the line I had drawn. The witness remained quiet, her calm presence a steady reminder of the clarity I had fought to establish. My father pressed his fingertips against the table, the gesture small but loaded with unspoken regret. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, the motion subtle but conclusive. The representative excused himself to process the cancellation, leaving the three of us in a silence that felt slightly warmer than before. My father finally looked up. "I thought you'd help me," he said, not accusatory, just tired. I softened my posture but not my stance. "I can help you," I said, "just not like this." His eyes drifted to the window, where sunlight edged through the blinds in thin, wavering lines. The witness closed her notebook, offering a small, understanding nod. My father rubbed his forehead with the heel of his palm, a gesture of someone realizing the limits of his own shortcuts. I didn't move closer, but I didn't pull away either. The clarity between us wasn't cold, it was necessary. When the representative returned, he placed a short confirmation page on the table. "The loan is paused pending withdrawal," he said. My father took it with a quiet, reluctant acceptance. I gathered my materials calmly, sliding each piece into the folder with deliberate care. The weight inside it felt lighter now, as though the papers themselves had released their tension. My father stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "I shouldn't have pushed you," he said. "No," I replied gently, "but now we both understand where the line is." As we exited the room, the hallway felt brighter, the air less constricted. The click of the door behind us echoed in a way that felt like an ending, not abrupt, but earned. After the meeting, I drove home slowly, letting the quiet of the road absorb the lingering tension. The sky was a muted blue, drained of the storm's weight, but still carrying a softness that matched the heaviness in my chest. When I stepped into the house, the stillness greeted me like a familiar but distant companion. I set the folder on the table and stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether I felt relieved or hollow. Part of me wanted to pretend the morning had never happened, to bury the discomfort the way I used to. But another part, the part shaped by the past week, knew I had crossed a point I couldn't step back from. I pulled out the chair and sank into it slowly, the wood cool beneath my palms. The house felt too quiet, reflecting the thin space between what I had done and what I almost allowed myself to do. The thought unsettled me. How close I had come to signing just to end the conflict. It wasn't the paperwork itself that frightened me. It was the impulse to surrender my instincts for the sake of peace. I pressed my thumb along the grain of the table, grounding myself in the small physical reality of the moment. My father wasn't malicious. He was desperate. But desperation has a way of blurring justification, turning need into pressure and pressure into expectation. I closed my eyes and let the memory of my grandfather's steady voice drift through my mind. Not any exact phrase, just the impression of restraint and patience he carried so effortlessly. I breathed in slowly, feeling the tension settle lower, quieter. The boundary I drew today wasn't just between me and my father. It was between who I had been and who I was becoming. I reached for the loan documents again, flipping through them slowly. Not because I needed to review them, but because I needed to face what had almost happened. The final page, the signature line, sat blank, its emptiness strangely heavy. I touched the edge of the paper with my fingertip, imagining the version of myself who would have signed without looking, who would have apologized afterward for hesitating. "Not this time," I whispered to the quiet room. The words didn't feel triumphant, they felt sobering. I set the document aside and rested my hand on my chest, feeling my breath rise and fall beneath my palm. It struck me how fragile resolve could be when confronted with love, fear, and history all at once. And yet, despite the fragility, it had held. As the afternoon light drifted across the floor, I leaned back in the chair and let myself consider the possibility that I had gone too far, that maybe I should have been more forgiving, more flexible. The thought threaded through me with quiet guilt. But then, another truth surfaced. Forgiveness didn't require blindness. Flexibility didn't require surrender. I let my eyes wander to the window, watching a bird hop along the fence, feathers catching the light in muted glints. The simplicity of the moment steadied me. I wasn't turning my back on my father. I was refusing to become collateral in a problem he had created long before I was ever asked to solve it. That distinction felt heavy, but it was real. My gaze drifted back to the torn edge of the loan packet, where the paper had frayed slightly from being handled so many times. I lifted the page gently, feeling the thinness of it between my fingers. It would have been so easy, almost effortless, to sign. A few seconds, a small motion, and everything would have shifted. The ease of the act contrasted sharply with the weight of the consequences. I swallowed slowly, letting the reality settle deeper. The room felt warmer now, the late day light softening the edges of the furniture. I placed the papers back into the folder, pressing the flap down with a quiet finality. Not out of anger, not out of defiance, out of alignment with what I now understood. I set the folder aside and exhaled long and slow, feeling a small, unexpected tremor in my hands. Not fear, release. I stood and crossed the room, letting the active movement clear the remainder of the tension from my shoulders. For a moment, I paused near the doorway and looked back at the table where the folder lay. I almost signed to avoid discomfort, I thought. I almost traded clarity for quiet. The realization felt like a thin thread pulling taut inside me. I wasn't proud exactly, but I was awake. I walked to the sink, letting cool water run over my fingers until my breath steadied again. Somewhere inside the calm, I understood something simple and difficult. Choosing integrity sometimes meant stepping away from the very people you wanted to hold on to gently. The next morning, sunlight filtered into the kitchen in thin, even strips, marking the floor like quiet reminders of order. I sat at the table with my laptop open and the confirmation document beside it. The house felt unusually calm, as though it sensed I needed the steadiness. I dialed the attorney's office, and after a brief hold, the familiar voice of his assistant answered. I stated my name, my file number, and asked to confirm activation of the clause. Her tone shifted slightly, professional but with a faint thread of recognition. Yes, she said. It was processed last night. The certainty in her voice carried more weight than I expected. I wrote the confirmation time in my notebook, underlining it once. The air felt clearer, cleaner. It wasn't triumph, it was validation. When the line transferred to the attorney himself, his voice sounded steady, the same composed cadence I remembered from years ago when he helped my grandfather finalize estate paperwork. You did the right thing, he said. Not dramatic, not comforting, just factual. I exhaled, feeling the breath move unhurried through my chest. Can you verify the protection extends to any loans associated with the account he opened? I asked. Paper rustled softly on the other end as he reviewed the details. Correct, he said. You cannot be bound to any agreement you didn't explicitly authorize. The simplicity of the phrasing soothed something inside me. I nodded even though he couldn't see it, letting the truth settle into the spaces where uncertainty had been clinging. We discussed the next steps, documentation, written boundaries, the importance of keeping everything in one place. His tone wasn't rushed. It carried a patience that felt almost unfamiliar compared to the urgency I had been immersed in. Your grandfather anticipated situations like this, he added. The words struck me with a quiet force, not because they were surprising, but because they confirmed what I had slowly come to understand. That care isn't always soft. Sometimes it's built into structures designed long before the moment they're needed. I stared at the papers on the table, their edges catching the morning light. Thank you, I said, for everything. He paused briefly, then responded. He trusted your judgment. It's good to see you trusting it too. When the call ended, the silence that followed felt steady, not hollow. I placed the phone down gently and looked at the confirmation page again. The clear, structured language anchored me. No emotion, no ambiguity, just law. I traced one of the lines lightly with my fingertip, absorbing the certainty it carried. I opened the drawer beside me and pulled out a small wooden frame that had been tucked away for months. Inside it was a photo of my grandfather, sitting at his desk, glasses perched low on his nose, a faint smile carved into the creases of his face. I set the frame beside the documents, aligning the edge carefully. He had been gone for years, yet somehow his presence felt as alive as the ink now protecting me. My chest tightened, not painfully, but with a sense of quiet gratitude I didn't know how to fully name. The printer buzzed to life beside me as I printed a fresh copy of a legal correspondence. The pages came out warm, smelling faintly of toner and heat. I gathered them into a neat stack, the weight light but significant. I slipped them into a plastic sleeve before adding them to the folder. The organization felt ceremonial, necessary. Outside, a faint breeze shifted the curtains, carrying in a whisper of cool air that brushed the back of my neck. I rolled my shoulders back, letting the tension release with the motion. Each piece of documentation was a reminder that clarity didn't need permission. It simply needed to be claimed. The house creaked softly, timber settling, the day stretching awake, and I felt myself settling too. I closed the folder and placed it gently beside the photo frame. The soft click of its cover landing felt final and grounding. I sat for a moment, palms pressed flat against the table, letting the quiet sink into me. The path ahead wasn't simple, but it was clear. And clarity, I realized, was a form of safety I hadn't allowed myself in years. I stood slowly, sliding the folder under my arm. Before leaving the room, I glanced once more at my grandfather's picture. "I get it now," I said softly. The sunlight shifted across the table, catching the edge of the frame just as I turned away, leaving the room with a steadiness I hadn't felt since this began. By late afternoon, the sky had dimmed again, swollen with another round of rain. I stood near the window, watching the first drops gather on the glass before sliding down in thin intersecting lines. Something about the pattern held me still, an unintentional choreography of threads weaving downward, separate but connected. It reminded me of old afternoons at my grandfather's house, when he'd sit on the back porch, repairing torn fishing nets, his hands steady, even when the world around him felt uncertain. I could almost hear the scrape of his chair on the wooden planks, the soft click of his pocket knife closing after trimming a frayed edge. Back then, I never understood the patience it took. Standing at the window now, I felt a tug of recognition. Protection wasn't just about building walls. It was about mending what could break before anyone noticed the tear. The rain thickened into a steady drizzle, soft but persistent, tracing silver paths across the glass. I leaned closer, feeling the coolness of the window seep through the sleeve of my sweater. The sound of rain had always calmed me, but today it felt like a quiet affirmation, one that matched the rhythm forming in my chest. I let my forehead rest gently against the glass, breathing slow, even breaths. The past week had carved out pieces of me I didn't know needed shaping. Hesitation, clarity, strength born not from defiance, but from understanding my limits. The water streaks outside tangled and untangled again, and I wondered if growth sometimes happened exactly like this. Messy, fluid, only recognizable when enough distance revealed the pattern. I stepped back from the window and wrapped my arms loosely around myself, feeling the faint chill in the room settle over my skin. A memory slid quietly forward. My grandfather once showing me how to tie a basic knot used to repair netting. "A good knot holds without strangling," he'd said. "It keeps what matters in place, but lets the water pass through." I didn't grasp his meaning then, but today it echoed through me with startling clarity. I walked to the table and opened the folder, flipping through the documents slowly, not to analyze them, but to acknowledge them. Each page carried a weight I had finally learned how to hold without letting it pull me under. I traced a single line of text with my fingertip and felt a calm steadiness settle into my hands. The rain softened, its rhythm gentler now, like a breath exhaled across the roof. I let the quiet expand around me, filling the spaces where tension had lived for days. There was no triumph in what I had done, only a quiet acceptance. I wasn't saving my father, and I wasn't abandoning him. I was learning where I ended and where he began. The boundary felt neither harsh nor cold. It felt necessary. I sat down again, letting the cool wood of the chair support me. The air smelled faintly of damp earth drifting in through the cracked window. My breath moved more freely than it had in days, as if something inside me had finally stopped bracing for impact. I reached for the notebook where I had written my boundaries and read them slowly, letting each line settle like a step taken on solid ground. The rain outside had begun to ease into a thin mist, barely audible. I nodded to myself, not in approval, but in recognition. These limits weren't walls meant to keep anyone out. They were anchors, meant to hold me steady when emotion pulled too hard. I closed the notebook gently and placed it on the table. The soft scrape of its spine against the wood felt grounding. I glanced back at the window, where the rain had tapered into faint, delicate strands. They formed a loose, shimmering pattern, unforced, natural, steady. I turned off the lamp and let the dim, gray light from outside fill the room. The fading rain left thin trails on the glass, threads that glimmered briefly before dissolving into nothing. I stood quietly, sensing a soft shift inside me, a release that didn't feel dramatic, just honest. I crossed the room and closed the window, letting the latch click gently into place. The house felt warm again, no longer carrying the edge of uncertainty it had held all week. I took a final look at the faint rain lines disappearing into the darkening sky, and whispered a simple acknowledgement to myself. I'm still learning. And that was enough. The next morning arrived with a muted palette, soft gray sky, damp air, and a hesitant sliver of light filtering through the blinds. I set a fresh document on the table titled, Conditions to Proceed. The words looked stark against the blank page, but they aligned with the clarity I had fought for. I outlined the first requirement, independent legal review for any future request. Then, a cooling-off period, 72 hours non-negotiable. The act of writing felt steadying, each sentence a quiet defense against the kind of urgency that had nearly undone me. I read each line aloud to myself, the cadence slow and calm, like a verbal contract with my own resolve. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, yet it felt like the walls had widened somehow, giving space to the person I was becoming. When my father arrived later that afternoon, he stood at the door with an expression that hovered somewhere between resignation and hope. I invited him in, not with warmth, but with civility. We sat at the table, the air between us taut with unspoken history. I slid the written terms across to him, careful not to let the gesture carry accusation. Before we discuss anything else, I said, these are my conditions. He looked down at the page, scanning the first lines. You're making this difficult, he murmured. His voice wasn't sharp, it was wounded. I folded my hands in my lap. No, I'm making it clear. His eyes lifted, searching my face for softness. I didn't look away, but I didn't bend either. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. You don't trust me anymore. The statement floated between us, shaped more by fear than blame. I took a slow breath. I trust what's documented. That's the only way either of us stays safe. He looked back at the page, the lines outlining boundaries he had never needed to confront before. This feels like punishment, he said quietly. I shook my head. It's structure. His brow furrowed as he read the section about legal review, then the time buffer, then the requirement that no agreements be made verbally. You think I'd trap you? I think you've acted out of desperation, I replied. And desperation isn't precision. The air seemed to cool as the truth settled across the table. We sat in a long silence, the kind that revealed more than it concealed. I watched his shoulders slope, the lines around his eyes deepening, as though the weight of the past weeks had finally caught up to him. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, his voice almost fragile. I rested my fingertips lightly on the edge of the document, grounding myself before I spoke. I know, I said, but that doesn't undo the impact. His gaze drifted to the window, tracing the subtle movement of curtains stirring in the afternoon breeze. Years of unspoken expectation hovered around him, visible now in the tension of his jaw and the slight trembling of his hands. For the first time, I realized he wasn't fighting me. He was fighting the possibility that I might no longer be willing to carry what he had always assumed I would. He lowered his eyes back to the page, rereading the terms slowly. His breathing steadied, though the reluctance in it remained. So these are the rules now? he asked. The word rules landed heavily, though I refused to flinch at it. They're boundaries, I replied. For both of us. The distinction seemed to pause him. His shoulders lifted on a slow inhale, then sagged with the exhale. The air felt different now, less charged, more grounded. He tapped the edge of the document with one finger. I don't like it, he said. You don't have to, I answered gently. You just have to respect it. He nodded once, the movement small but genuine. I felt a quiet shift, subtle but unmistakable. After a moment, he reached for a pen resting near the center of the table. I watched his hand hover, then land softly as he signed the bottom of the page. Not as approval, but as acknowledgement. The gesture carried no triumph for me, only relief. He pushed the paper back toward me without speaking, his eyes reflecting something closer to acceptance than agreement. I gathered the document carefully, sliding it into the folder with deliberate calm. The house felt still, anchored by the clarity that now existed between us. He stood slowly, his movements heavier than when he'd arrived. As he walked toward the door, he paused just long enough to say, I hear you. And for the first time in days, those words felt like a foundation rather than a plea. 2 days passed before my father reached out again. His message was short, "Can we talk?" But the wording felt more grounded than before, less urgent, more human. I agreed to meet him on the porch in the late afternoon, when the light was soft and the air cooled just enough to quiet the world. He arrived carrying nothing this time, no folders, no expectations disguised as documents. He sat down slowly on the wooden chair across from me, his posture deflated in a way I hadn't seen in years. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet wasn't hostile, it was tentative, uncertain. He rubbed his palms together, then looked up with an expression that held both apology and fear. I need to tell you something, he said, and the fatigue in his voice felt heavier than the words themselves. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as though bracing himself against a truth that had been pressing on him for far too long. The project I invested in, it failed months ago, he said. I thought it would turn around. I thought... His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. I listened quietly, not rescuing him from the admission. He continued, I borrowed to cover the first loss, then more to cover that. I kept thinking one good month would fix it. His confession poured out unevenly, shaped by regret rather than strategy. Hearing him speak this plainly felt like looking at a version of him stripped of pride. I felt something shift in my chest. Not sympathy exactly, but a recognition of the human flaw in him that he had tried so desperately to hide. I didn't want you to see me like this, he said, voice low, almost ashamed. The rawness in his tone revealed more than the words themselves. He wasn't asking for permission or forgiveness, just space to be honest. I rested my hands in my lap, fingers loosely intertwined. You could have told me, I said quietly. He shook his head with a small, defeated motion. You always believed I could fix anything. I didn't want to lose that. A breeze moved across the porch, carrying the faint scent of wet soil from last night's rain. I let his words settle, letting silence answer first. I don't need you to be invincible, I finally said. I just need you to be honest. He looked at me then, his eyes tired but clear. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, trembling breath. I've made too many decisions out of fear, he said. Fear of failing, fear of disappointing you, fear of looking small. His admission was quiet, but it widened something inside me. The man who'd always insisted on certainty was confessing uncertainty in its rawest form. I watched his hands, slightly shaking, fingers curled inward as though gripping something invisible. Dad, I said gently, fear doesn't make you weak. Hiding it does. He closed his eyes for a moment, the lines on his face softening. The weight of everything he'd been carrying seemed to loosen, even if just slightly. The afternoon light settled on the porch railing in muted streaks, grounding the moment in a fragile stillness neither of us rushed to break. He sat quietly for a while, staring at the grain of the porch boards beneath his feet. "I didn't ask you because I trusted you'd help," he said. "I asked because I was desperate enough to hope you wouldn't question it." His honesty cut sharper than any accusation could have. I let the words rest between us, not dodging their weight. "I don't blame you for failing," I said softly. "But I can't carry the fallout for choices I wasn't part of." He nodded slowly, as though the truth finally reached a place inside him that had resisted hearing it. The breeze picked up again, rustling the wind chimes hanging by the door. Their soft clinking filled the pause with something delicate, almost forgiving. When he finally lifted his gaze again, it held a vulnerability I had never seen in him, an admission of limits, of fear, of being deeply, undeniably human. "I don't know what to do next," he said. The simplicity of the statement felt heavier than all his earlier urgency. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't promise to fix anything. I simply said, "Start with honesty. Everything else comes after." His shoulders eased a fraction, as though a burden he had been gripping too tightly had loosened by its own weight. The light shifted across the porch, casting a soft warmth over the boards between us. For the first time in weeks, the space didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like a beginning, an unsteady, imperfect, but genuine one. The following morning, my inbox held a new message from the attorney, subject line concise, tone unmistakably formal. I opened it slowly, letting each sentence anchor itself before moving to the next. He confirmed that the protective clause was fully active and that all financial instruments tied to my name were insulated from liability. The words were clear, precise, and firm enough to quiet the last remnants of doubt still lingering at the edges of my mind. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the past weeks shift ever so slightly off my shoulders. The morning light through the curtains softened the edges of the room, casting a muted glow over the table where my documents lay in organized stacks. Clarity didn't feel triumphant. It felt like a slow exhale I'd been holding without realizing it. I reread the confirmation once more, letting its finality settle deeper. I printed the legal notice, the paper emerging warm beneath my fingertips. The attorney's language was as restrained as ever, almost clinical, but the implications held a quiet power. "You are protected from any financial obligation initiated without your explicit consent." I whispered the line aloud, as though hearing it would help it become part of me. The printer hummed in the background, steady and rhythmic, reminding me that the world kept turning, even when personal turmoil felt all-encompassing. I placed the printed page atop my folder, smoothing the corners with a small, deliberate gesture. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was reacting. I felt like I had stepped into something I had avoided for too long. My own authority. My phone buzzed with a message from my father. "Let me know if there's paperwork I need to fix." The bluntness surprised me, not because of its tone, but because it carried something he had rarely offered: accountability. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let his words sit beside the quiet of the room. I walked to the counter, poured a glass of water, and took a slow sip, grounding myself in the simplicity of the moment. When I returned to the table, I typed a short response. "The attorney has confirmed protection. I'll send you the explanation so you understand the boundaries." My fingers hovered before pressing send. I didn't add reassurance. I didn't soften the message. Truth didn't require cushioning. When the message delivered, I felt a subtle shift in my chest. Something like relief, but steadier. I gathered the folder, opening it to review everything one final time. Each document, each note, each printed email marked a step in the process of reclaiming ground I hadn't even realized I'd surrendered over the years. I traced the margin of one page lightly with my thumb, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. The room felt still, the kind of stillness that follows resolution, not conflict. The soft tapping of the ceiling fan overhead became a metronome to my breathing, guiding it into a calm, even pattern. I realized I wasn't afraid of the future fallout. I wasn't avoiding discomfort. I was simply choosing not to absorb someone else's consequences. That understanding didn't spark triumph. It sparked self-respect. I emailed my father the attorney's summary with a brief note, explaining the protective mechanisms now in place. No emotion, no lecture, just clarity. A few minutes later, he replied, "Understood." The single word carried a weight I didn't expect. Not surrender, not resentment, just acknowledgement. I set my phone down gently and looked out the window, where early sunlight glowed faintly against the driveway. The moment felt neither dramatic nor dull. It felt earned. I slipped the confirmation document into its sleeve and placed it in the folder, aligning the edges so everything sat flush. Organization had become its own quiet ritual, an act of restoring order to something that had once felt chaotic. As I closed the laptop, a soft sense of finality settled around me. Not an ending, but a release. The early morning light filtered across the room, catching the polished edge of the table and reflecting upward in a thin, warm line. I rested my hand over the folder for a brief moment, letting the surface cool beneath my palm. I wasn't victorious. I wasn't defeated. I was simply intact. The air felt lighter, as though the house had been holding its breath along with me, and finally let go. I stood, taking a slow inhale that filled every corner of my ribs, then exhaled with a grounded steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with quiet certainty. I had protected myself, and that was enough. By the time I drove to my father's house, the afternoon light had settled into a soft gold that brushed the tops of the trees and warmed the quiet street. I parked at the curb and sat for a moment before stepping out, letting the hush of the neighborhood steady my breath. The folder rested on the passenger seat, its weight more symbolic now than literal. When I picked it up, the edges felt cool against my palm. I walked up the familiar path to his door, noticing the small things I'd never paid attention to, the worn groove on the step, the faint squeak of the railing. He opened the door before I knocked, as though he'd been waiting. His expression was cautious, but not defensive. "Come in," he said quietly. The simplicity of his tone wrapped the moment in something unexpectedly gentle. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, a scent I associated with childhood mornings and unhurried weekends. He gestured for me to sit at the dining table, the same table where he'd once helped me with school projects, the one that held the marks of years we never acknowledged. I placed the folder in the center and slid it toward him with a soft motion. "These are the documents you asked me to review," I said. He didn't touch them right away. Instead, he watched the folder like it carried a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The silence between us didn't feel sharp anymore. It felt like a space where honesty could exist without collapsing into conflict. I folded my hands, waiting without rushing him. He opened the folder slowly, flipping through the pages with deliberate care. Each paper made a hushed sound as he lifted it, the soft scrape of ink against fiber, carrying more weight than words ever could. I watched his expression shift, first concentration, then recognition, then something quieter. "You organized everything," he murmured, almost surprised. I nodded. "I wanted you to see exactly what I saw." He paused at the attorney's confirmation, rereading the lines that had anchored me so firmly. His jaw tightened briefly, not with anger, but with the realization of how close he had come to pulling me into his collapse. When he finally looked up, there was no defensiveness in his eyes, only a tired acceptance that softened something sharp between us. He closed the folder gently, pressing his palm on top of it as though steadying himself. "I didn't expect this to be so final," he said quietly. His voice carried a roughness I hadn't heard before, not from frustration but from understanding. I leaned back slightly, giving him space. "It's not a punishment," I said. "It's closure." The words seemed to land heavily between us. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table, tracing the old nicks and dents as though they held a history he was just now noticing. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for," he said after a moment. I didn't respond right away. The compliment wasn't something I needed, it was something he needed to say. He pushed the folder back toward me. "These belong to you," he said. "They're your decisions, your protections." The gesture caught me off guard. For so long I'd assumed he wanted control over the narrative, but here he was returning it to me without resistance. I rested my hand on the folder but didn't pull it away. "They're also your clarity," I replied softly. "They show where we stand." He nodded, his shoulders easing in a way that suggested he finally understood the boundary, not as rejection but as truth. The room felt quieter but not empty, more like a space where breath could settle without fear of breaking something delicate. As I stood to leave, my father walked me to the door. He didn't offer apologies he couldn't sustain or promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he placed a hand briefly on the doorframe and said, "Thank you for not abandoning me, even when you had every reason to." I felt something in my chest loosen, not forgiveness, not absolution, just a small release of tension I hadn't realized was still there. I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the warmth brushing my skin in a quiet, grounding way. The weight of the folder in my hand felt different now, not a burden, but a boundary upheld. As I walked back to my car, I understood something simple and steady. Returning the documents wasn't an ending. It was a return to myself. That evening, after returning home, I sat at the dining table with the house quiet around me. A low hum from the refrigerator filled the background, steady and soft. The folder lay open in front of me, though I didn't touch it. Instead, I opened my laptop to review the financial spreadsheets my father had sent earlier, a gesture that surprised me more than anything he'd said at the porch. The files loaded slowly, rows of numbers arranging themselves into an unflinching truth. I leaned closer, scrolling through line after line of expenses, transfers, and interest charges. It wasn't chaos, it was erosion. Small decisions accumulating into something heavy enough to collapse a person. My fingers hovered over the trackpad as I traced the timeline. The missing money wasn't stolen or hidden. It was consumed by hope born too late and fear acknowledged too late. As I dug deeper, patterns emerged. A promising quarter followed by 2 disastrous ones. A failed vendor deal. A desperate attempt to shore up losses with quick credit. I felt no anger reading it, only a quiet, sobering clarity. This was the truth he'd been running from. Each red line in the spreadsheet held its own quiet plea for correction. Near the bottom of one file, I found a note he had typed months ago but never removed. "Temporary setback. Recover soon." The optimism seemed painfully small against the numbers surrounding it. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the reality not as accusation but as context. Understanding didn't require excusing. It simply allowed me to see the whole picture instead of the shadow he'd tried to stand in front of. I printed the final summary page and placed it beside the folder, aligning the corners by habit. The smell of warm toner and ink rose from the sheet, a scent I now associated with protection, clarity, and uncomfortable truths. I rested my fingertips on the paper and breathed in slowly. What struck me most wasn't the financial collapse itself. It was how long he had tried to outrun it. Desperation isn't loud. Sometimes it's paperwork filed in too much haste, emails written too late, or numbers dragged forward in the hope they'll fix themselves. I let my thoughts settle, knowing that the urge to carry someone else's weight can feel noble until it starts sinking you both. I closed my laptop gently, the soft click punctuating the stillness of the room. Outside, dusk settled in with a muted violet glow, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood and stretched my back, feeling the ache of hours spent bent over numbers that weren't mine to fix. Yet I felt no resentment, only a cautious empathy threaded with newly formed boundaries. I walked to the window and cracked it open slightly. Cool air drifted in, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the faint hum of distant traffic. It grounded me. I wasn't here to repair his mistakes, but I wasn't here to condemn him either. The difference was beginning to feel like a form of adulthood I had been avoiding. Returning to the table, I gathered the documents into a neat pile, slipping the printed financial summary into the back of the folder. It didn't belong at the front. It wasn't a directive. It was simply the truth. I pressed the cover closed and let my hand rest on it for a moment. In the quiet, I whispered a line I didn't expect. He really tried. Not successfully, not wisely, but sincerely. The acknowledgement didn't excuse the pressure he put on me. It only softened the edges of the fear that had been gripping him. I breathed out slowly, letting the understanding settle without swallowing me whole. Compassion without sacrifice, a balance I was still learning to hold. I slid the folder into the drawer where I kept important documents, not to hide it, but to put it in its rightful place. Its weight no longer felt like a burden pressing against my ribs. It felt like a story that had reached the chapter where the hardest truths had finally been spoken. I switched off the dining light, leaving only the warm glow of the hallway spilling through the doorway. As I walked toward the living room, I carried with me a strange, steady calm. I didn't have to solve everything. I didn't have to rescue him. I only had to stay honest. With him, with myself, with the future I was building. And as the house settled into its nighttime quiet, that felt enough. My father called the next morning, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual insistence. "Can you come by?" he asked. "There's something I want to clarify." The tone wasn't demanding, it was tentative. I agreed, driving over with a steady calm I wouldn't have recognized in myself weeks ago. When I arrived, he was sitting on the porch steps, hands clasped loosely, staring at the sidewalk as though the concrete held an answer he'd misplaced. I sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance. For a while, the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves carried by a mild breeze. He finally looked at me, eyes red-rimmed, not from anger, but from exhaustion. "I need to finish telling you the truth," he said, and the tremor in his voice told me he meant every word. "I didn't just lose money," he began, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "I lost trust. From partners, from people who depended on me." His fingers tightened around each other. "And I tried to pretend I still had control, that if I acted confident enough, the problems would shrink." He exhaled shakily. They didn't. I listened without interrupting. His confession felt less like a burden being placed on me, and more like a weight he was finally willing to put down somewhere real. "When I brought you those papers," he continued, "I wasn't thinking about you. I was thinking about escape." The words struck me with a quiet ache. Not because they surprised me, but because he finally said them aloud. I folded my hands, grounding myself in the steadiness of my own breath. He turned toward me, eyes glossy. "I wasn't trying to use you," he said, "but I was willing to let your safety come second to my panic. And that's the part I can't defend." His voice cracked, the admission raw, unpolished. I took a slow breath before responding. "I wanted to believe you didn't see the risk," I said softly. "But you did. You just hoped I wouldn't." The truth hung between us, sharp but not cruel. He nodded slowly, shoulders slumping under the weight of something he'd resisted acknowledging. "I'm ashamed," he whispered. I let the silence answer, not to punish him, but to honor the depth of what he'd finally said. Shame wasn't a wound I could close for him. It was one he had to let heal in its own time. He ran a hand over his face, the gesture slow, weary. "I want to fix what I can," he said. "Not by asking you to sign anything, not by pretending I'm fine. I mean actually fix it, step by step." The determination in his tone was fragile but real. I felt something inside me settle, a shift that made space for a kind of cautious hope I hadn't expected. "That's a start," I replied. "But you need a plan, not just resolve." He gave a faint, tired laugh. "I don't know where to begin." I nodded. "Then begin with honesty. The rest follows." He looked at me again, softer this time, as if seeing me not as the child he'd once guided, but as an adult he needed to meet on level ground. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper, a rough list of debts, contacts, overdue invoices. "This is everything," he said, handing it to me. I unfolded it carefully, scanning the columns. It wasn't neat, it wasn't complete, but it was the first transparent thing he'd offered me since this ordeal began. I folded it again, pressing the creases gently. "I can help you understand this," I said, "but I won't carry it for you." His eyes met mine with a mixture of relief and acceptance. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "Just don't walk away while I face it." The vulnerability in his voice didn't pull me in or push me away. It simply settled beside us, honest and unforced. We sat in silence for a moment longer, letting the weight of the conversation find its own place. The afternoon light softened across the porch, brushing his face in a muted glow that made him look older, but also more human. "I'm here," I finally said. Not a promise without limits, not a vow to solve his troubles. Just presence, real, contained, healthy. He nodded, a small but genuine motion that carried more sincerity than any apology he could have offered. As I stood to leave, he placed a hand briefly on my forearm. "Thank you," he whispered. It didn't feel like closure, or reconciliation, or anything neatly defined. It felt like truth shared at the right depth. And sometimes, that was enough. In the days that followed, life settled into a quieter rhythm. No urgent calls, no unexpected knocks at the door, no documents waiting like unanswered questions. The air inside my home felt lighter, as though the walls themselves had released a breath they'd been holding on my behalf. One morning, while reviewing my bank alerts, I noticed something. There were no pending authorizations, no inquiries tied to the account my father had opened. It was untouched, dormant, neutral, a clean slate. The protective clause had done exactly what it was meant to do: deflect responsibility before it reached me. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the relief settle not as a surge, but as a calm, steady settling at the base of my ribs. Protection wasn't loud. It was the quiet absence of crisis. Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea warming my hands. The neighborhood was unusually still, the branches above me stirring with a soft breeze that carried the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. I replayed the past weeks in my mind, tracing the arc of fear, confrontation, clarity, and finally steadiness. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. My father's mistakes hadn't disappeared, but neither had my boundaries. They rested side by side, no longer in conflict. As I sipped the tea, I realized something unexpected. Protecting myself didn't distance me from him. It allowed me to see him more honestly, without the blur of obligation. The understanding settled gently, like something that had been waiting to be named. When my father finally updated me, it came through a brief text. Loan withdrawn. No further action needed. No panic. No guilt woven into the words. Just clarity. I read the message twice, then set my phone down beside me. I felt neither vindication nor bitterness, just quiet. The kind of quiet that follows truth spoken without force. I leaned back in my chair and watched the shifting shadows on the driveway. He was doing what he needed to do, facing his consequences without offering them to me in disguise. For the first time, I trusted that process. Maybe trust didn't always look like faith. Maybe it sometimes looked like boundaries held long enough for someone else to stand on their own feet again. That evening, I opened the drawer where I'd placed the folder and took it out. I flipped through the documents slowly, feeling their weight not as burden but as history. Every page represented a moment where I could have broken and didn't, where I could have surrendered clarity for comfort and chose differently. I placed the attorney's confirmation on top and rested my hand over it. My breath moved evenly, often by a sense of resolve that felt neither rigid nor fragile. I realized then that adulthood wasn't marked by age or accomplishment. It was marked by the moment you stopped abandoning yourself in order to save someone else. That truth felt like the quietest form of strength I had ever known. I reorganized the folder carefully, sliding each page back into its protective sleeve. The act felt ceremonial, an acknowledgement of both the damage that was avoided and the growth that had taken its place. When I closed the cover, the soft thud echoed faintly in the room, grounding the moment. I placed the folder back into the drawer, not buried but simply stored. A chapter, not a wound. Outside, the late evening sky shifted into a deep blue, holding the last traces of daylight like a quiet promise. I stood by the window and watched as a few porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood. Steady, constant, ordinary. The simplicity of it soothed me. Before going to bed, I stepped outside for some air. The night was cool, the sky clear, a scattering of small stars barely visible against the dim city glow. I breathed in deeply, letting the stillness settle in my chest. There was no dramatic closure, no sharp ending, just a calm sense of alignment. My father and I were not fixed, but we were truthful, and I was no longer a silent participant in choices that weren't mine. As I stood there, feeling the quiet night wrap around me, I understood something I hadn't before. Avoiding the debt wasn't the victory. Choosing myself was. I whispered a simple thank you to the dark, not addressed to anyone in particular, just to the path that had brought me here, steady and intact. Then I went inside, closed the door gently, and finally rested. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. No final confrontation, no shouted apologies, no heroic rescue. What happened was quieter and somehow more honest. My father withdrew the loan. I kept my boundaries. And we began, slowly, to speak to each other, without the weight of unspoken fear between us. There's no perfect resolution here. Just two people learning how to live with the truth instead of hiding behind expectation. Sometimes protection doesn't look like stepping in. Sometimes it looks like stepping back. Sometimes love isn't sacrifice, it's clarity. And sometimes the strongest thing you can say is simply, no. As I closed the drawer on the last of the documents, I realized something simple. Avoiding the debt wasn't the victory. Choosing myself was. And maybe that's the lesson I had been circling all along. That adulthood isn't about fixing everything, but knowing what is and isn't yours to fix. If this story reminded you of someone in your life, or if you've ever had to draw a boundary you never thought you'd need, tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, your strength. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe.